Moral Fairground, and we're really looking to, engage more with you, learn more about your journey in this intersection of profit and purpose, promoting fair trade across the world, and being the leader of the World Fair Trade Organization. So absolutely grateful for having you today. And for those who are going to be viewing this at a later stage when we release it, they'll probably get to know more about you, more about your journey, and just share all these nuggets of inspiration, because that's something that we hope to be able to communicate with our communities. So to kick off, why don't you start off with just a bit about yourself, your journey, and the World Fair Trade Organization?
Thanks, Pavid. I mean, it's an absolute pleasure to be here and to be speaking with you. It's great to connect across the world at a time when we can't travel, we can't meet face to face in many places. So this is certainly the next best thing. My journey is I'm Turkish Australian. I was born in Turkey, grew up in Sydney, Australia, and through my career have always tried to unpack this question of what is really the core driver of business. How can we get business to be as much of a force for good as possible? So I started that journey I grew up in a small business family. I started my own business at one point, doing some furniture importing into Australia and creating some brands, and I moved into law. I studied law for a while and worked in that area before going and working in the big guys at Procter & Gamble in the big consumer goods industry in market strategy, where I learned a lot about, what the engine was behind business, how decisions were made, what were the big considerations in markets. And then at that point, I sort of had a little bit of an epiphany. I wanted to go deeper into some of these questions about social purpose and mission, and went and volunteered in West Africa, in Liberia, in Ghana, in a Liberian refugee camp, working on a range of different projects, including microfinance, but teaching in the local school there, and that sort of enlightened me to a possibility of working in development, which took me through what was AusAid at the time. It's now been folded into the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. But that was amazing for several years to work as part of the Australian aid program, predominantly in Indonesia, on market-based approaches to get farmers into supply chains and create livelihoods opportunities. The Australian aid program certainly at that time did amazing work, really trying to empower communities and build the reputation of Australia and benefit Australia, I think, through that work. And from there, moved to Oxfam, moved to Oxford, where I currently am connecting to you from. And 7 years there working in campaigning on a range of issues, from trying to get big food and beverage companies to improve their supply chain sourcing, to helping cooperatives of farmers get off the ground and develop, to establishing the Future of Business initiative, which was really looking at how do we re-engineer business for the 21st century. And then I was fortunate enough to join the World Fair Trade Organization as their next chief executive. And that sort of came around at the end of 2017. And I've been with the World Fair Trade Organization since. Long story short, the World Fair Trade Organization is the global community and the global verifier of those social enterprises that fully practice fair trade. So we can talk a little bit more about that distinction of and what's going on within the different systems within the fair trade world, because there are different systems that serve very important functions. Ours is the only global one that really focuses on, have you built your entire business around the purpose of fair trade, around the purpose of benefiting economically marginalized producers. It's not a commodity system. It's not about, is the cocoa in the Kit Kat fair trade? It's about, is the alternative to Kit Kat, indeed, is the alternative to Nestle built around the entirety of the fair trade vision, the 10 principles of fair trade?
Yeah, that sets the tone for this discussion, and gives us a good idea for, especially for those who are going to view it and who don't know much about fair trade already. It's a great start. And On that note, actually, recently the World Fair Trade Organization changed its messaging towards promoting the movement of social enterprises. Can you give us a bit of an idea of what that is like and what sort of went behind the scenes about that decision?
Sure. I mean, we have to go back about three and a half decades to understand that journey. So the World Fair Trade Organization was established in 1989. It's the oldest international network of fair trade. It was called EFAT at the time when it was founded, and essentially it was a network of the pioneers of the fair trade movement. And when fair trade first started, and the initial sort of seedlings of fair trade go back to the 1940s and 50s in the US, with organizations like 10,000 Villages, which still exist and is still a WFTO member, who set up an entire business around that purpose of saying, let's create trade opportunities that generate livelihoods opportunities, and let's reinvest our profits. Let's make the entire mission of this enterprise focused on this. So the term didn't exist at the time, but the pioneers of fair trade had created social enterprises because these were mission-led, purpose-driven enterprises that were very deliberate about putting people on planet before increasing their profits. As a result, I mean, the term fair trade, I think, encompassed this, and over time, other systems came in that were incredibly effective at certifying specific commodities or specific ingredients or specific factories, but they weren't asking the bigger question about, when you see a fair trade label, the brand and the company that owns that whole thing, what's their purpose and mission? Beyond what they might do on an ingredient to ingredient level or commodity to commodity or supply chain to supply chain level, the entire business, what does it exist for? Because we've also seen that those businesses have come and gone from the fair trade movement when they see that they get a sufficient reward from consumers to justify the costs of being part of that system and to trade sustainably. When they see that reward, they stay with it. The minute that the calculations tell them otherwise, the spreadsheets say that it's not what the ROI, the return on investment, isn't sufficient to justify that effort, they walk away. So those businesses are very different. We want them to buy as much from fair trade sources as possible, but there's a separate trajectory for enterprises that exist through thick and thin. Regardless of whether they make more or less profit, they will practice fair trade across the entire spectrum of their supply chains and their entire business and their entire operations. So that's who we were, and that's what fair trade was when it started. It was a social enterprise model. It was about putting fair trade into the bloodstream of the entirety of a business. The social enterprise world kind of evolved later, and our sort of group of pioneers, these fair trade enterprises that have existed for decades, they never really changed the terminology. They said, well, we're fair trade. We're what fair trade originally was. This is the centerpiece of fair trade as a idea and a movement. So we just call ourselves fair trade, and that's good enough. But I think that we needed to sort of update our terminology to explain that we're not just about the trade or the product. We're about the entirety of the enterprise that owns and runs this thing. And so the social enterprise language became a very natural one. It became quite organic. A lot of the newer organizations joining the WFTO, which, by the way, spans 76 countries in its membership, a lot of the new ones coming in self-identify as social enterprises. And it's a term that sort of resonates more in some parts of the world than others. There's lots of linguistic kind of challenges overall, but I would say it became a very appropriate way to talk not just about the product and the trade of a specific commodity or ingredient, but about the entirety of the business and why it exists and what its mission is.
Yeah, that puts this into perspective, because a lot of times it's very easy to get confused between what the World Fair Trade Organization does and what the fair trade labeling actually is. And early on, I must confess that I also was very, very confused, because I saw a fair trade product that says, oh, okay, great, it's fair trade, it's the same thing. But it actually spans across different levels and tiers of impact and what it stands for and what it actually addresses, right?
Yeah, it is a different thing. Our members did come together to create a product label to talk about who that enterprise is. as well. So the guaranteed fair trade product label that they own, they don't pay a license fee to use, because we're essentially a cooperative of all of these social enterprises around the world. We're co-owned by them. The biggest and the smallest have the same voice. It's a one member, one vote system. They decide at our annual general meetings big things like, should we launch a product label, and should there be a license fee to use it, and those sorts of things, which are live commercial issues. They voted to do that, and they voted to have a product label to communicate the distinctiveness of them as fair trade enterprises and fair trade organizations. But maybe a live example would be, for instance, if I give you the example of Makita, for instance, in Ecuador. They're a cooperative, farmers cooperative. So, okay, they're involved in agriculture, like a lot of the fair trade world in different fair trade systems. But they do the chocolate processing. They do the cocoa processing, the chocolate manufacturing as part of this farmer community cooperative. They put their own brand, the Makita label on that as a brand. They're not trying to become a supplier to Nestle or to Cadbury's, Mondelez, or any of the global players. Their economic vision is actually the higher value added parts of this. We think that the farmers should own. We think that the community should own, and we think should be run by enterprises with a primary mission of benefiting economically marginalized communities and producers. If you contrast that with any of the other sort of fair trade systems, which are essentially about saying, well, another company, a corporate, can come in and buy one of its ingredients for one of its products in one of its markets on fair trade terms, and then communicate this to consumers through a product label, which is an important, a critical solution we need to also offer the corporate world. You do see that those are different economic visions for the world. One of, I would say, let's make fundamentally flawed global corporations less bad and make them have benefit wherever possible, to one we're saying, let's create a new economy that is populated by enterprises like Makita, or enterprises like Manos del Uruguay, which is owned by a network of women's producer cooperatives who then have their own brand, have their own enterprises, creating the value up the supply chain. Or Township Patterns, which is a network of women cooperatives across the townships of South Africa, which own the enterprise that then works for them to create opportunities for them. Or, in Europe, El Puente, which is a multi-stakeholder organization based in Germany, which is owned partly by the workers of its own organization, as well as the supply chain, as well as its founders, and is transferring the profits back into its social mission constantly. So these are very different enterprise models that I think are propositional about the kind of economy they want to create.
Yeah, that's very interesting. This sort of dual value creation, while you're looking at redefining how an enterprise works, how an organization runs, and who the ownership of it also. It's a very interesting challenge. And while you sort of propagate this idea of doing so, what are the key challenges for such organizations, or perhaps even for the World Fair Trade Organization, going into this new realm of the sharing economy, so to speak? What are the key challenges as a movement or as an enterprise within the fair trade space?
I mean, Pavid, I think that there's a range of people or challenges that any organization in sort of the ethical space is dealing with. First and foremost, it's becoming an increasingly crowded space. 30 years ago, when our members were, quite prominent and were driving the fair trade movement, fair trade was generally the only game in town for ethical consumerism. But now if you pick up a product by corporation A, B, or C, you'll read things on there about that would confuse you, that would make you think, wow, this sounds a bit like a social enterprise almost. Oh, they're doing a project here, or one of their ingredients is being sourced in a particular way, and there isn't sort of a way of holding to account across the board the extent of a business's ethical benefits to society. Everyone talks about something good they're doing, which sort of muddies the waters to think, oh, well, there's a false equivalence here. They're all generally pretty good, and and we look like we're generally on the right track, and we're not. I mean, our planet is burning, our ecology is being destroyed around the world. We've got an addiction to a kind of economic growth that requires increased consumption by everyone constantly, which means increased use of natural resources. And meanwhile, we've got spiraling inequality, entrenched poverty, 800 million people that remain hungry, who are left out of economic development. And if we're going to have to re-engineer our economy, we have to do it in a way that also pulls them up. So all this stuff that isn't working in our economy. But if you believe some of the sort of spaghetti soup of ethical claims made by corporations and brands, you'd think, wow, we're really on the right track here. Let's just keep going down this. But I think we're driving off a cliff edge of ecological disaster and spiraling inequality. And the only way we're going to get into a different route and sort of veer off, going off that cliff edge, is to re-engineer the fundamentals of our economy, which critically includes the enterprise model. That the business model exists to maximize the growth of financial capital, and that is the litmus test for every decision. That's the litmus test to whether or not they source one of their ingredients from the Fair Trade International or the Fair for Life or the Nature Land Fair sort of programs, certification programs. That's the litmus test for whether they want to pay their workers a living wage, or whether they want to have long-term commitments, or whether they want to adopt solar energy in production. It's a litmus test that puts a straitjacket on business. So I think we need to sort of unravel some of those economic underpinnings and create enterprises that are alternatives. But a big challenge for us is standing out and communicating that, because it's taking me 10 minutes to explain to you why I think this is absolutely critical, and why the World Fair Trade Organization's community of enterprises is part of that new economy that's emerging. COVID has obviously brought up a whole host of new challenges as well. So we're not lacking in the number of things we're trying to tackle.
Indeed, it is very interesting, because while you are trying to define this completely new norm, we live in a system that is where this whole idea of profit is so embedded, it's so deep rooted in the system, and we're so hardwired to focus on that one thing and that one goal, and it's a rat race. So trying to take a step back and actually look around us and see the actual atrocities that we've caused in this process is so critically important. And while doing that, I would like to know what is the sort of alignment. While I know personally more about fair trade and sustainable development goals, because I've engaged with it at a university level and all of that. But for those who get to view this at a later stage, what is the kind of alignment that the World Fair Trade Organization, or the intersection of that and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals?
I mean, I could spit off the individual SDGs that very obviously align, whether it's no poverty or zero hunger, reduced inequalities, and gender equality, which are central, I think, to the enterprises that I work for. But at a planetary level, if you break down these SDGs as you've got, ecological ones. So we've got to live within a particular planetary, without exceeding a planetary boundary, within the limits of our planet's carrying capacity. But we've got to deliver a whole bunch of social goals as well. We've got to deliver the foundations socially. And I'm quoting here from my former colleague, Kate Rayworth's work on donut economics, by the way. So if those are this is the limit of our planet, and this is the minimum of socially what we need to deliver, then what we're talking about essentially is, how do we create those social benefits with the minimum ecological environmental footprint? I mean, we'd love to get to a regenerative economy, but before we even get there, we need to at least minimize our environmental footprint. So suddenly the question then becomes, across the SDGs, if you look at them as a whole, for every unit of environmental footprint that economic activity creates, how do we have maximum livelihoods generation, and preferably livelihoods and opportunities for people who are marginalized? Now that's the central question of the World Fair Trade Organization's guarantee system. Have you built a business that is deliberate about trying to put the interests of economically marginalized people first. So as a result, a lot of the production models are artisanal. They use indigenous techniques. They use natural fibers from the local area. They create products that are creating the highest number of livelihoods possible per unit of sale. So that environmental footprint, which is already minimized in the model, is also maximizing the number of people who earn from it and isn't extracting out of it for billionaires dividends that take money out of that circulation. So if you look at it from those terms, you've actually got a model that transcends the entirety of the Sustainable Development Goals. But obviously we can tick through multiple ones, and it's hard to find one that doesn't relate one way or another. I mean, even things like healthy, like life below water and talking about our oceans. There's a host of enterprises like Rice and Carry in Sri Lanka, which is cleaning up the waterways in eastern Sri Lanka, taking the plastics out and turning them into new products on a fair trade basis. That's part of the WFTO community. You know, there's organizations like Green Glass in Chile, which is working with people who live on the streets to give them opportunities to collect waste and turn that into new products. You know, there are organizations that are trying to address the refugee crisis, like in Women Craft in Tanzania, which works with Burundian refugees to try to create new products, including from old, disused World Food Program food sacks that end up being lying around the refugee camps. They take them, these are artisanal people. I mean, refugees, you know, they have amazing skills, many of them. They've come from places where they've been earning livelihoods with them. So creating a social enterprise around that refugee camp that is taking both the output of the refugee programs and the World Food Programs, sacks, and turning that into a new product, the skill and a livelihoods opportunity. So these are sort of the centerpieces of our movement's enterprises. It goes, I would say, far beyond fair trade. And what's interesting is that if I put my old business hat on, it wouldn't be worth your while to set up a business in these places. The risk is too high. You wouldn't bother going to sort of the Maoist insurrections in Nepal to bother creating a business that has to go through very difficult terrain to go and source from marginalized producers who are cut off by conflict. You wouldn't bother going to a refugee camp. It's not, the risk return doesn't quite add up. You can make enough money. It's commercially viable. And there's a key distinction there. Viability and profitability is different to profit maximization and getting the highest ROI possible. Those are very different realities. So you can be commercially viable, but the effort and the risk is really high, and you have to really commit yourself. And that's essentially our exam question. So if you've gone through the WFTO guarantee system, it means you've set up a business that is intention to do that has that in its core of its DNA.
Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective, and it also goes on to show that when you look at the SDGs or any sustainability oriented framework for that matter, the more you unpack it, you realize some things, while they may not explicitly state that they match, they effectively do, such as waterways and all these other things. And each and every organization works in a completely different manner to target a different problem. And I think collectively as a movement, all of that effectively contributes to fair trade, which makes absolute sense. And that's a very interesting thing. So when you're looking at profitability and economic viability, as well as the risk factor for businesses to adapt to this new sort of strategy. So, for example, if it's an existing enterprise, a for-profit enterprise, but is, I think, trying to look into, say, models that work and is willing to take that risk, what is the kind of measures that they should sort of look into to become a World Fair Trade Organization affiliate? Or potentially, why should a business like that move into something that is profitable, but has that high level of effort and high level of risk?
So I think companies in more sort of the mainstream corporate world have got a number of ways of approaching this. One is that they can at a minimum, they can begin sourcing where possible from fair trade enterprises and social enterprises and farmer cooperatives around the world. And there are certifications available for them, but they can also source from our members. So some of our members are also happy to be suppliers to global companies, as long as they embrace aspects of fair trade that make it possible for our members to continue doing their practice of fair trade. In terms of transforming yourself, I think the big question is, are you at liberty to do that? Because sometimes the financial markets won't allow it. It has to, essentially what we're saying is you're looking at a model that gives exclusive power and exclusive priority to increasing the wealth of shareholders, and everything else must fall in line underneath it. So where there isn't a trade-off, great, they'll do the right thing as well as deliver bumper dividends to their shareholders. But overall, that's the model. I mean, the boards are 100% elected by shareholders. The biggest shareholders, the richest shareholders, get the biggest dividend checks. They own the most shares. And on the board, actually, they owe fiduciary duties towards shareholders. So if you're trapped in that model, you have to sort of wriggle out of that legal straitjacket and governance straitjacket that you've been put into. And I think that means essentially changing constitution and bylaws to sort of allow directors to put other considerations ahead, not just alongside, not just consider those, but ahead of the urge to increase profits and wealth for shareholders. Once you've done that, I think a whole host of possibilities opens up. I mean, we do have large companies that are part of the WFTO. Dr. Bronner's, which is based in California, over $100 million in revenue per year. They're a member. They're fully verified as a guaranteed fair trade enterprise. They put the majority of their profits back into their social mission. They practice fair trade everywhere it's possible across all of their supply chains. They don't pick and choose and say, we just entered a new market in country X and the consumer doesn't reward us, so we're not going to bother with fair trade. They don't make that calculation. They do it regardless. There are other businesses like Malongo Coffee in France, another large company that has been able to go through our system. It's possible, but it means you can't fudge the question. You can't pretend like you can't do both. You can't say, yeah, I'm also going to make even more money for my shareholders, and I'm going to be the most sustainable thing ever. There are moments where there are real trade-offs. There are moments where it's more profitable not to embrace fair trade. And the way you price things, the long-term commitments, you give up leverage when all our members are required to have long-term commitments to their suppliers. You can't chop and change, because when you chop and change, you retain leverage. But that comes, there is a financial calculation underneath that. You stay committed to your suppliers regardless of what currency fluctuations are going on, or whatever's happening in terms of the difficulty of doing business. You have to stay committed, unless it's absolutely impossible. These long-term business relationships are a completely different economic philosophy, and they require really deep-rooted change, I think, in the corporate model. So it's also about being honest and saying, am I really ready to do that? If not, there are other things available to you. You can become a B Corp. You can source certain ingredients from fair trade. You source certain completed products from the WFTO community. There are things you can do. You can do corporate procurement. That is, you can buy your bags, you can buy your books, you can buy your furniture, you can source from social enterprises, and there are programs to do that we're also a part of. So all those options are very much open, but the important thing is, if you want that big transformation, then that really requires looking yourself in the mirror and confronting sometimes the financial markets to say, I'm not going to have this as my sole priority going forward.
Okay, that puts a lot of things into perspective throughout this discussion, because one of the things I was thinking of while you were saying that is, in terms of corporate partnerships with World Fair Trade Organization members, and creating that procurement policy throughout their supply chain. So, like you said, there might have to be fundamental changes in some ways so that they're able to adapt to the fair trade process. But what does it take for a corporate partnership to occur with a World Fair Trade Organization member?
Well, I mean, we have a standard, so they have to fulfill the 10 principles of fair trade across their business. The first question is about the mission of the business, and it's an important exam question to get through, because then the other bits really wouldn't be possible. So if they go to WFTO.com, there's a supplier search where they can look for suppliers, and there's also a join WFTO part of it as well that sort of has key aspects, and there's a whole section on our fair trade system that sort of explains the criteria and the specifics that they would need to go through. But anyone who applies, we have a model that's been created by these social enterprises around the world. So it hasn't been created by a bunch of experts sitting in a room in a European capital somewhere. Because we are essentially a cooperative model ourselves, we have to work through, in a bottom-up way. And our guarantee system has got audits every 4 years. So someone independent comes in every 4 years to verify what's going on is truly aligned to the 10 principles of fair trade across all their suppliers. A subset of suppliers get also verified as well, and get checked and get visited to see if the suppliers of our members are also practicing fair trade and are treated in the right way. There are peer reviews in between those 4-year audits. So they visit each other to verify and to identify ways they might want to improve their practices. And because we've got over 400 of these enterprises across more than 76 countries now, in most countries, there's another WFTO member that's been part of this movement that can also go and visit and help write a short report on the goings on. And they're also doing regular updates of self-assessments on those 10 principles of fair trade. So we have this sort of triangulation model that is trying to also minimize the audit burden, because that is a costly thing. Having someone visit with a clipboard every year that a lot of certification systems require is expensive and difficult, especially for the kind of enterprises I've just been talking about. Just getting to some of these places it can cost a fortune. So what we've created and innovated is what is called the participatory guarantee system, which does have an element of that. So we are getting 4 yearly checks, and if it's a very high risk business, it can become more frequent than 4 years. Generally, it's every 4 years. And in between, the peer visits mean that, that there's another element of checking, and then the self-assessments that might seem in the WFTO headquarters reviews is another element. Gives us sort of enough of a balance of credibility and making sure we get to that minimum level required, alongside having something that's fit for purpose and that's affordable for the kind of enterprise we're talking about, not just bigger corporates.
This is great information for anybody who's looking into being a part of the movement, as well as really looking at being connected with these businesses, because they're doing great things for the world. And let's be honest, we all need to pull up our socks and start moving towards this shared vision of a much more redefined economy than we strongly sit in. And on that note, actually, I want to move into a little bit of a more topical tangent, which is around this current global pandemic, this crisis that we did not anticipate. Suddenly something happens and it turns us into a full spin. But in terms of this current situation, what has it been like for the World Fair Trade Organization? And in terms of prioritizing its workload, and in terms of being able to address key challenges within, what has the current crisis turned into for the World Fair Trade Organization?
I mean, it's been a real mixed bag, Parvit. I mean, when it first hit, what I was incredibly proud of was that back in March of 2020, we had WFTO members immediately realize that they need to adapt, that the market's changing rapidly, and start producing face masks, face coverings, PPE for the market. And this was a new undertaking for many. I mean, a lot of them work with groups of producers who work with fabrics, who make a whole host of different products anyway, but few, I don't think any actually, were making masks, face coverings, PPEs at the time. They came together under the umbrella of a project created by the World Fair Trade Organization's Asia branch, WFTO Asia, and that created a whole host of collaboration. So they started like exchanging design ideas. They started experimenting with different ways of producing and started sharing their experiences and failures and successes of product creation. They started marketing together. They created a joint product label calling itself the People's Mask. They try to, where possible, supply their local community and local society with these products that they were creating as well. It was a real amazing show of what's possible when a community of mission-led enterprises come together, which in the mainstream economy would see each other as competitors because they're often selling to the same markets, but actually because their driver is not profit maximization, they're able to put down any of those instincts and say, let's collaborate, let's share materials. You know, they were doing online tutorials and webinars for each other. You know, Tim, one of our sort of stalwart leaders in the fair trade movement in Armenia, sort of came together with his colleagues in Sri Lanka online, with colleagues from Bangladesh and India and Nepal and across Asia and across the world, and started exchanging ideas and sharing, you know, ways to produce these products. And then our European and North American and a Trade Aid New Zealand, one of our, you know, most fundamental members, also started supporting these efforts, started buying them, started paying up front, and that started happening in other products. So when we look at our sort of developed economy members, their behavior was in stark contrast to mainstream brands that were cutting and slashing and reducing orders, but also squeezing their suppliers, using the desperation of the time as an excuse to increase their margins. To say, well, actually, unless you slash your price further, we're going to cancel this order completely. Complete opposite happened. For over 85% of our members, they started giving additional flexibility to their suppliers for payment terms. We started seeing examples where orders were placed saying, look, we know ports are closed currently in your country. We know that there's a lockdown and some of your artisans can't come in here, but we know you need the cash flow to keep going. Here's the money up front. Here's the order. Whenever you can produce this, please produce it and send it to us in Europe or in North America. And those sorts of acts of solidarity really kept things together. And one of the things we found, Parvit, we did a study late last year, early this year, with a bunch of academics from the University of Cambridge, University of York, and the Stockholm Environment Institute, alongside the NGO Tradecraft and us. I was one of the co-authors of this study that looked at the different kinds of enterprises that were in the WFTO community. And what we found was that they were 4 times more resilient than regular businesses. What we found was that they were much more able to get through difficult times. Can I pause for 1 second? I'm really sorry because there's someone at my door and I need to just let
Please go ahead. No problem at all.
This study that we did with academics and from across the world basically tried to unpack what is the difference between this enterprise model and the mainstream enterprise models. One of the things they found was they were 4 times more resilient, not because they made more money, not because they were more profitable, but because through times like this, they give each other more solidarity and more support, and they persevere. So for a lot of them, they might have folded and said, okay, we're better off sort of asset stripping here and just selling off because there's more value, there's more financial value in that than persevering with this business. But none of them did that. There was none that let off cut the salaries, cut the jobs in their enterprise. There was none that started cutting orders willy-nilly to sort of reduce their costs. Like, all of them realized their mission here was to generate and retain livelihoods. So even through thick and thin, there was this resilience, there was this perseverance that sort of kept through. And I think it came out of this study, and then we saw it a few months later in real life, why that resilience is higher among these sorts of fair trade enterprise models. We also found that the majority of their leadership is women. Majority of CEOs are women, majority of board members are women, majority of senior managers are women, and the majority of the livelihoods supported are that of women. This is all in stark contrast. I mean, 52% of the CEOs of these 400 plus organizations I'm talking about are women. I don't know of any global business community in the world that can make that kind of a claim, this is incidental. It's not a requirement. You don't have to have a woman CEO. There are some wonderful men CEOs as well in our movement. But when you set up a business with a social mission at its heart, all these other things happen. This solidarity, this collaboration, women's leadership, more gender equality in production lines and opportunities for other people. So I think it unlocks a whole host of unintended benefits, including on the environmental front, upcycling, recycling, natural fibers, zero carbon production that is now really taking off, especially in fabric production among our members. So all these things start sort of, I think, bubbling up that create a lot of excitement for us.
It is so inspiring, and it's a brilliant exemplification of how collaborative efforts to actually take on challenges instead of that classic, undercutting or, using the market strategies to kill your competition and focus on that single piece of pie versus donut economics. It is absolutely brilliant how organizations in the fair trade movement are getting together, collaborating and working, because it just makes more sense. If you are going to help each other out of this crisis, we're going to get out of there faster. We're going to help each other elevate. You're going to support the suppliers better. It's going to support your producers better. So it's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that story. It is very inspiring, and I hope to those who are going to be viewing this interview, please take some good notes from this, because it is great information. And on that note, I was actually in communication with one such fair trade organization a couple of hours ago. I had an interview with them as well, and they were saying absolutely taking that safety net into consideration, because a lot of grassroots level producers, a lot of artisans don't have that safety net, don't have that financial stability that you'd normally expect in a high-paying job. For that matter, it's not the 1% or the 10% that you're looking at, but you're looking at the rest of the world. And when you are looking at it with that lens, fair trade as a movement and fair trade organizations are significantly more impactful to support those communities. So could you touch base on that as well?
Yeah, I mean, an interesting example it would be, for instance, Creative Handicrafts in Mumbai. I've known their chief executive, Johnny Joseph, for some years, and when I speak to Johnny about his enterprise, which is owned by women workers, by the way, they do garments, they do all sorts of fabric-based products and sell across the world. Successful business, commercially very innovative. They're selling into department stores in France. They're selling into sort of e-commerce platforms around the world. It's a real innovative sort of business organization. But when I talk to him and I say, okay, so how do you decide which workers you're going to take on? He said, well, we deliberately look for people who have no other option. We deliberately go in, particularly victims of domestic violence, women who are single-headed households, who don't have another income in their household. They deliberately go and create employment opportunities for them. Now, it would be cheaper for him to go and hire people who are already trained, who already work in garment production in Mumbai. He wouldn't need to train them, but he trains them for a whole year where they earn a salary. So essentially, that's where the profits are going, into creating those opportunities. If you think of the question of additionality, if Johnny Joseph's enterprise, if Creative Handicraft, this women worker-owned fashion factory, did not exist in Mumbai, the women they employ would likely have no other option for livelihoods. If another competitor who's not a fair trade enterprise didn't exist, the people that work for them would have a much better shot, because they're cherry picking people who are going to be easiest for them to bring into the enterprise, versus Johnny cherry picking workers and deliberately going out and finding workers who have little to no other opportunities. But he sees a possibility in them if he invested into them. So that enterprise becomes the safety net. I mean, which is why all of us in the fair trade movement, and especially I would say the WFTO community, feel an immense responsibility right now to just keep getting through this crisis. Because if these enterprises take decades to get off the ground, it takes a long time to build a social enterprise. They're not going to mainstream finance markets and getting a massive influx of cash in order to grow their growing organically through their regular business model. And as a result, they can, if they fall over, it's going to take a long time to rebuild those businesses, and it's going to take, you know, much more effort to replace the livelihoods impact they have, because they reach people, they go to places that other businesses won't, that other businesses don't see the business case in working with. So I think that's why it's particularly critical as as sort of a social justice issue right now to stick with these sorts of enterprises, to go the extra mile, to look to find them and look to find the verified ones, because there are a lot of pretenders as well, a lot of people making claims that haven't been verified, you know, because there is some benefit somewhere in their supply chain, but that's a vastly different thing than the kind of enterprises we're talking about currently.
Absolutely, that filter needs to be in place, in the sense that we have to steer away as a consumer base as well. It's very important to be as informed as it gets. So read more from the World Fair Trade Organization's things, communiques and publications, and all these different tools and resources that we have. Because it's I've often found a lot of greenwashing, so to speak, or, you know, whitewashing and using labeling in order to for economic gain, as opposed to actually deriving some form of impact to other communities and your larger stakeholder base. So that is very true and very critically important. And on a more positive note, on a final question sort of note, I wanted to get your view of what the future holds for the World Fair Trade Organization and its community, and what do you reckon is something that we should look forward towards?
I mean, I think what's happening, and it's an incredibly important evolution, is an increased focus on environmental issues, an increased focus of ecological issues, and an increased awareness that they work together. I mean, an example is Prokriti in Bangladesh, that has realized that there's a whole host of garments that are being thrown out by the fast fashion factories in Dhaka in Bangladesh, and taking them and turning them into new products, is cleaning up the riverways, taking the water hyacinth out of the riverways, turning them into new products and creating livelihoods opportunities. This role in the circular economy, this role in sort of, you know, as I said, natural fibers, or the zero carbon fabrics that are woven across the WFTO community. You know, it's literally every continent now is happening. The hand woven fabrics that last longer, that allow consumers to have a cultural connection, that probably means they're not going to throw it out as quickly. So the product life cycle is longer, but also have got, you know, zero electricity and carbon emissions at production. Those sorts of things are becoming an increasingly important part of the WFTO business model, the Fair Trade Enterprise business model. Our members came together in Lima at the end of last year at our annual general meeting, and one of them put down a proposal saying, look, we do business in really tough places. We do business in really tough ways, and we compete in you know, in very difficult markets. However, the climate crisis is an existential threat to all of us. If we don't solve this, if we don't lead this, others won't. It's got to be us. We have to be on the cutting edge of fighting climate crisis. They voted. I mean, you can imagine these guys are working in slums, they're working in refugee camps, they're working in marginalized communities, and they're saying, we will lead on climate. We will take the extra steps on climate. And that came through. There was a vote, and it was unanimous. They said, yes, make it harder on the 10th principle of fair trade that we assess everyone on protecting the environment. Strengthen it, you know, make the bar higher, and do it in a way that allows us to demonstrate that fair trade is about people and planet, you know, and I think that's the bit that's exciting. That's the bit that's incredibly challenging, because there are costs associated with this. But at the end of the day, we live on a planet that we all rely on as mammals. We all rely on a healthy planet, and you know, seeing that inspiring revelation from these social entrepreneurs and cooperatives from around the world that work with marginalized people to say, we're gonna do the tough thing here, the hard yards on climate and the broader environmental, ecological issues. For me, that gave me a lot of hope, and that also demonstrated to me why these are experiments in the business models of the future.
Very well said. I totally agree on this because when I was doing my master's thesis, I explored this realm of profit with purpose, this intersection of social enterprises with business, trying to understand deeper into what really drives these people and what is working and what isn't. And you know, it just absolutely baffled me when I understood. The more I read, the more I understood about why it's so critically important. And having studied and understood sustainability, I'm one of the lucky few who really get what's going on. But for people who may not be as well informed, this is a great starting point to go out, read more, understand more about it, and really engage with these organizations. And when you're looking at starting your own enterprise, it's so useful to choose something that you resonate with, right? Choose a critically important problem, focus on that, and profit with purpose should be the new norm. Business as usual should be the old norm, and that's the way I see it.
Yep.
And yeah, that's absolutely great. It's been absolutely wonderful. May I say, the river of information that you've shared with us today is unreal, and I'm sure people are going to find these huge nuggets of inspiration or even gumballs that they can chew on for a long, long time. So thank you, Erinch. It was absolutely brilliant.
Thank you, Pavid. And if there are social entrepreneurs listening to this, people who lead purpose-driven enterprises, we'd love to welcome you into the WFTO community. We have an inclusive model of bringing people in and verifying them as fair trade enterprises. And for anyone who wants to buy fair trade products, you can find web shops of WFTO members. You can find the websites, and you can source from them as well through the WFTO.com website. So do look out for ways you could be part of this community or support and buy from this community.
Absolutely. You heard him. You got to do it, guys. Please go out and promote fair trade and be a part of the bigger movement. Thank you, Erinch. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pavid. It was a pleasure.
Let's get ready to walk the Bluestones again. Let's curse Punt Road. Let's ride the Frankston line. Let's dodge swooping Maggies. Let's cross the inglorious river. Let's get ready to chuck hook turns in the rain. Let's order obnoxious coffees. Let's queue for dimmies. Let's avoid outbound on the Tulla. Let's wear the blackest black. Let's Gertrude. Let's Bay. Let's Burke. Let's Hoddle. Let's Melbourne again. An initiative to reinvigorate Melbourne from those who love this city.